On the morning of December 22nd, 1980, a maid found a woman unconscious on the bathroom floor of a house on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. It was the second time. Her name was Martha Sharp Crawford. The world knew her as Sunny, a nickname given to her as a child for what her mother described as a disposition that warranted it. She had been born, not in a hospital, but on her father's private railway carriage, somewhere in Virginia, en route from Hot Springs to New York. The family called her Choo-Choo before they called her Sunny. She was 49 years old. She was one of the wealthiest women in America, the sole heir to a fortune built by a man named George Washington Crawford, former chairman of the Columbia Gas and Electric Corporation, who had died on April 6, 1935, when his daughter was not yet 3 years old. Her husband had been born Claus Cecil Borberg in Copenhagen in 1926. He had taken his mother's family name sometime after Cambridge. He had no money of his own. He had spent most of his adult life in the company of men who had more of it than he did. She had $75 million. He had found her on the floor. These facts are not in dispute, and they are not even close to the strangest part of what came next. I have spent a long time trying to understand how that happens. The usual explanations do not hold. It was not ignorance. It was not naivety. Something else was happening inside that house, and it did not begin with Claus, and it did not begin in Newport. It began much earlier than that. Chapter 1. The Money Before Sunny. George Washington Crawford was, by most available evidence, a man who became a fortune before he became a father. He had built his money in natural gas, controlling the Columbia Gas and Electric Corporation, the kind of wealth the early 20th century produced quietly and without the drama of oil barons or railroad kings. He was not famous in the way the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts were famous. He simply controlled the pipes that kept the lights on across a significant portion of the country, and he had done it at precisely the right moment in American history to become extraordinarily rich. His wealth at the time of Sunny's birth was estimated at $100 million. He was 66 years old when he married Annie Laurie Womack in 1927. She was 27. She was a socialite from St. Time. Louis, comfortable but not wealthy, close enough to serious money to understand it without having grown up inside it. The gap between them in age, in origin, in everything, was the kind of gap that money can bridge for a time, and that time eventually reopens. His daughter was not born in a hospital. She was born on September 1st, 1931, on her father's private railway carriage, somewhere in Virginia, while her parents traveled from Hot Springs to New York. The family called her Choo-Choo before they called her anything else. Then they called her Sunny, because the nickname fit the child she was, which was cheerful and attentive and almost impossible to upset. George Crawford died on April 6, 1935. His daughter was not yet 4 years old. What he left behind was a fortune, and a question that nobody in his daughter's world appears to have thought to ask. The fortune was enormous and self-perpetuating, the kind that grows in trusts whether anyone pays attention to it or not. The question was simpler and more dangerous. Who was going to teach this child what the money was and what it wasn't? Who was going to be there when the people it attracted arrived? Nobody asked. Nobody answered. Annie Laurie Crawford was his opposite in nearly every visible way. Where George had built things, Annie Laurie moved through them. She remarried within a few years of his death, comfortably and well, becoming Annie Laurie Aitken, and she set about raising her daughter inside a world of country houses, European travel, and the kind of careful social positioning that wealthy American mothers of that generation understood as their primary obligation to a child. What she built for Sunny was a life with no obvious edges. The right schools, the right summers, the right people at dinner. Thanks to her mother's groundwork, Sunny entered Newport society at the very top of the ladder, which meant she entered it the way people enter rooms they have been prepared for since childhood. With ease, and without understanding that the ease itself was something that had been constructed for her, rather than something she had earned. What Annie Laurie could not construct was a father, And what nobody in Sunny's world appears to have noticed, or noticed and chosen not to address, was that growing up as the only child of a very large fortune, with a mother who had her own life to rebuild, and a stepfather who was cordial and present, and not her father, had produced in her daughter a particular quality of stillness that looked like contentment from the outside. It was not contentment, it was the particular self-containment of a child who has learned very early that the people around her have their own concerns, and that adding her own to them is not something she is supposed to do. Sunny was known for her love of opera and reading. People who knew her in those years described someone who listened more than she spoke, who was more comfortable at a piano than at the center of a room, who had a quality of attention so complete that people in her company consistently felt they were the only person she was thinking about. She was sent to finishing school in Europe, then to London to study music at the Royal Academy, because Annie Laurie had noticed that her daughter was serious about it in a way that most girls in their world were not, and she was practical enough to give that seriousness somewhere to go. She was also, by every account that survives, extraordinarily shy, not the performed shyness of a girl who has been taught that modesty is attractive. A genuine preference for the edges of rooms over their centers. A genuine preference for one conversation over 20. In her younger years, people said she resembled Grace Kelly. She came back from London in the late 1950s with a musical education, a quality of attention that people found either calming or unreadable, depending on how well they knew her, and a fortune that had been sitting in trusts since April 6, 1935, growing without her, waiting for her, belonging to her, in a way that nothing else in her life quite belonged to her. She was in her mid-20s. She had never been asked what she wanted from any of it. She had been given it, the way everything in her life had been given to her, by people who assumed that having enough was the same thing as being protected. It was not the same thing. The first man she chose was a prince. It seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of choice the world she had grown up in had been preparing her for. It was not the choice that would define her life, but it told you something about what she was looking for, which was not money, because she had more than enough, and not status, because she had been handed that at birth. She was looking for something she had never been given a name for. Something that felt, from the outside, like security, and that she had been searching for since a man died on April 6th, 1935, and left behind everything except himself. Chapter 2. The First Marriage. The first man she married was a prince. His full name was Alfred Eduard Friedrich Vincenz Martin Maria Prince von Auersperg. He was Austrian, from one of the oldest aristocratic families in Europe. The kind of lineage that came with a title and an address, and very little else by the time the 20th century had finished with the empire it came from. He was handsome. He was socially polished. He moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had been told since childhood that rooms were built for people like him. They married on July 20th, 1957. She was in her mid-20s. They had 2 children together. Alla was born in 1958. Alexander followed in 1959. Sunny moved between the houses that came with that life, and she was, by every account, a devoted mother in the particular way that women, who were themselves raised without much direct parental attention, tend to be devoted. She paid attention. She showed up. She remembered. The marriage ended in divorce in 1965. What it left behind was 2 children she was fiercely protective of, a settlement that added to the fortune she had already inherited, and something harder to quantify. A confirmation, perhaps, that the world she moved in did not produce the kind of men who stayed. There is a detail about Alfred von Auersperg that the coverage of the von Bülow case rarely mentions. In 1983, 3 years after Sunny fell into her coma, Alfred was in a car accident in Austria. He lingered in an irreversible coma for 9 years. He died in 1992. 2 people Sunny had married and had children with both ended their lives in comas. The coincidence is so extreme, it barely registers as one. It registers, instead, as something else, something closer to a pattern that nobody in her life recognized until it was too late to matter. What nobody around Sunny appears to have understood at the time, and what she herself may not have understood, was that the thing she was looking for in a second marriage was not what she thought it was. She thought she was looking for a partner. She was looking for someone to fill a space that had been empty since April 6th, 1935. Claus von Bülow understood that space. He knew exactly how to stand in it. Chapter 3. Claus. Claus von Bülow was not what people expected. He had been born Claus Cecil Borberg in Copenhagen on August 11th, 1926. His father was a Danish playwright. His mother came from a prominent German-Danish family, the von Bülows, whose most distinguished member had been Fritz Toxwert von Bülow, Justice Minister of Denmark, in the government of Claus Berntsen. Claus took that name at some point after Cambridge, where he had read law. He deployed it with the ease of someone who had never given much thought to whether it fully belonged to him. He was tall. He was precise. He had the kind of dry wit that plays well in rooms where people are already comfortable and looking for something to cut through the comfort. After Cambridge, he worked briefly as a barrister in London, then became a personal assistant to J. Paul Getty, the richest man in the world. He travelled extensively in that role. He managed the particular logistics that fortunes of that scale require. He understood wealth from the inside, without having any of his own. He met Sunny in 1966 through mutual acquaintances. She was in her mid-30s, recently divorced, quietly wealthy, and had a quality of stillness that he seems to have understood immediately for what it was, not passivity, attention. They married on June 6, 1966, at the Brick Presbyterian Church in New York. Cosima was born the following year. From the outside, the marriage looked like what Sunny's world produced as a successful outcome. Claus was cultured and presentable and could carry a dinner table. Sunny was, by this point, on the world's best-dressed list. They split their time between a spacious Fifth Avenue apartment and Clarendon Court in Newport. They were, by every visible measure, exactly what they appeared to be. Inside, it was a different calculation. Sunny had asked Claus to give up his work and devote himself to their family. He had agreed. He came to describe this arrangement, in the years that followed, as being a hired ornament. He wanted London. He found Newport provincial. He had come from the orbit of the richest man in the world, and he had ended up attending charity galas on a street in Rhode Island. He had a mistress. Her name was Alexandra Isles. She was an actress, known to television audiences as Victoria Winters on Dark Shadows. He did not conduct the affair with particular discretion. By 1979, both Claus and Sunny were speaking openly to people around them about the possibility of divorce. Alexander and Alla noticed all of it. They had grown up inside their mother's money and their mother's gentleness, and they had watched Claus move through it with the restlessness of a man who felt he deserved something larger. They said so to each other. They said it occasionally to their mother. Their mother listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything and did not change anything. Cosima was 12 years old. She loved both of her parents. She would spend the rest of her life paying for that. The house where all of this was happening was one of the grandest, on the most expensive street, in one of the wealthiest towns in America. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Chapter 4. Newport. Bellevue Avenue, in Newport, Rhode Island, exists for one reason. It was built by the people who had more money than anywhere else in America could comfortably contain, and who needed somewhere to put it that other people with the same problem would recognize and respect. The Vanderbilts had built on it. The Belmonts had built on it. The houses were not called houses. They were called cottages, which was either a joke or a form of understatement so extreme it had become its own kind of boast. Clarendon Court sat on the southern end of the avenue. It had been built in 1904 by the architect Horace Trumbauer, who had found its design in a book of drawings by the 18th century Scottish architect Colin Campbell, and reproduced it almost exactly in pale stone on 7 acres of Rhode Island coastline overlooking the cliff walk. It had a cobblestone courtyard, a carriage house, panoramic views of the Atlantic, and high stone walls behind an iron gate that kept Bellevue Avenue at a specific remove from whatever was happening inside. Sunny had bought it and filled it with everything she knew how to provide. Flowers in every room, music in the evenings. She was a member of the Newport Reading Room and the Sprouting Rock Beach Association. She appeared at charity events and sat on the right committees and conducted the social life of a woman who had been raised since childhood to know exactly how that was done. The staff stayed for years. The maid, Maria Schrollhammer, had been with her long enough to know the house in the way that only people who actually run a household know it, which is from the inside out, from the laundry rooms and the kitchens and the service corridors that guests never see. What Maria saw in those corridors was a marriage. Claus served on the boards of the Preservation Society and the Newport Casino. He appeared at the right events. He was a good host when he chose to be. He was witty and knowledgeable and could carry a dinner table with the ease of a man who had spent 20 years in the company of people who expected to be entertained. But Newport bored him in a way he made insufficient effort to conceal. He had come from the orbit of J. Paul Getty, a man whose daily decisions affected governments and economies, and he had ended up attending fundraising dinners on a street in Rhode Island. He found the social rituals provincial. He found the ambitions small. He had described himself, to people who later testified about it, as a hired ornament. The ornament had a mistress. Her name was Alexandra Isles. She was an actress, known to American television audiences as Victoria Winters, a character on the daytime Gothic serial Dark Shadows. Claus did not conduct the affair quietly. By the late 1970s, it was the kind of open secret that Newport's social world accommodated by not discussing it directly and discussing it constantly in private. Sunny knew. By 1979, she and Claus were both speaking openly to people around them about the possibility of divorce. The marriage had been strained for years. Claus wanted out. What he could not resolve, and what the people around him believed he had not resolved, was the question of what leaving Sunny actually meant. Leaving Sunny meant leaving Clarendon Court. It meant leaving the Fifth Avenue apartment. It meant leaving the life that her money had built, and that his presence in it had never quite justified. He had no income of his own. He had no savings of consequence. He had a name he had borrowed from his mother's family, and a set of social skills that required a wealthy woman's resources to express themselves properly. He could not afford to leave. Alexander and Alla had watched all of this from the time they were old enough to watch. They had grown up inside their mother's money and their mother's gentleness, and they had watched Claus move through it with the particular restlessness of a man who feels he deserves something larger. They did not trust him. They said so to each other. They said it occasionally to their mother. Their mother listened in the way she listened to everything, which was completely and without visible reaction, and she did not change anything. She loved him, or she needed him. In the life Sunny had built, with its flowers and its music, and its careful hospitality, and its high stone walls, the two things had become difficult to separate. Cosima was 13 in 1980. She had grown up inside the house on Bellevue Avenue, loving both of her parents, with the uncomplicated totality that children love people before the adults around them make that totality impossible. She would spend years paying for it. On the evening of December 21st, 1980, the family gathered for Christmas at Clarendon Court. A dinner was served in the dining room behind the iron gates. The table was set. The decorations were up. Those who were present described the meal as tense. Nobody spoke much. Sunny displayed confusion during dinner and a lack of coordination that the people at the table noticed and did not address directly. She was helped to bed. Maria Schrollhammer found her on the bathroom floor the following morning. Chapter 5. The Black Bag. The bag was found in a closet in Claus's study at Clarendon Court. It was black. Inside it were drugs, sedatives, and a needle. The needle was later tested by a biochemist. It came back positive for insulin. Sunny was a diabetic. An injection of insulin, in sufficient quantity, administered to a diabetic patient who had been drinking, could induce a coma that would be difficult to distinguish from one produced by natural causes. Claus von Bülow had no medical reason to possess a needle coated in insulin. This was not the first time something had gone wrong at Clarendon Court during a Christmas gathering. On the evening of December 26, 1979, Sunny had been feeling weak. The family had come together for the holiday in Newport, the way they came together every year behind the iron gates on Bellevue Avenue. And the evening had proceeded in the way that evenings inside that household proceeded, which was with the surface intact and the tension underneath it. Alexander had helped his mother to her bedroom. She was unsteady. He got her there and left her and went to bed himself. The maid Maria Schrollhammer heard noises from Sunny's bedroom at around 9:30 the following morning. She went in. She could not wake her. She found Claus. Claus did not call a doctor immediately. This is not in dispute. It was a fact that he later explained and that others later challenged, and that the prosecution at the first trial presented as evidence of something. What is not disputed is the timeline. Maria found Sunny around 9:30 in the morning. It was 2:00 in the afternoon before Claus telephoned a physician. The doctor was not immediately available. Claus left a message. The doctor arrived. Sunny was vomiting. She was gasping. She went into cardiac arrest. The doctor revived her, and she was rushed to Newport Hospital, where she arrived in a comatose state with blood sugar levels that the attending physicians described as exceptionally and inexplicably low. She was administered large doses of glucose. Her levels stayed low for hours. After 24 hours of treatment, she regained consciousness. She recovered from that incident. The doctors attributed it to hypoglycemia, complicated by alcohol. They warned her against overindulging on sweets, against going too long without eating, against drinking. They told her the combination of reactive hypoglycemia and alcohol was medically dangerous. They sent her home. No foul play was suspected. Alexander was watching. He had been watching for longer than anyone around him seemed to realize. He had grown up inside his mother's gentleness and his mother's money, and he had watched Claus move through both with the restlessness of a man who felt he deserved something larger and the calculation of a man who understood he could not afford to leave. He had watched the affair with Alexandra Isles, conducted without particular discretion. He had watched his mother absorb it with the same stillness she brought to everything. He had watched Claus fail to call a doctor for 4.5 hours while his mother lay unconscious in her bedroom. He did not have proof of anything. He had the particular unease of a child who loves someone completely and cannot protect them and cannot explain why they feel the need to. After the first coma, he began paying a different kind of attention. He was 22 years old when his mother was found on the bathroom floor for the second time on the morning of December 22nd, 1980. The scene this time was different. She was not in bed. She was unconscious on the floor. She was not revived after 24 hours of glucose. She was not revived at all. She was transferred from Newport Hospital to Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in Manhattan, where the neurologist confirmed what the Newport doctors had suspected. The brain damage was severe. The coma was not the kind that resolved. The woman who had been born on a private railway carriage in Virginia and named for her cheerful disposition, and who had filled Clarendon Court with flowers and music, and the kind of attention that kept a staff loyal for decades, was in a tachyc, persistent vegetative state. She would not wake up. Alexander hired Richard Koo, a former Manhattan district attorney, to investigate privately. He told him to find out what was in the bag. Koo found it, in Claus's closet. He photographed everything inside it. He had the needle tested by a laboratory. The results came back positive for insulin. He brought Alexander everything he had found. Alexander took it to the Newport County authorities. In July of 1981, 7 months after the bathroom floor, Claus von Bülow was indicted on 2 counts of assault with intent to murder. Cosima was 14 years old. She had grown up inside a house with 2 parents who had both, in their different ways, been devoted to her, and she was now being asked, by the simple fact of what her brother had done, to choose between them. She did not choose. She held to both for as long as holding to both was possible. and then she held to her father, because her father was the one who needed holding to. Sunny's mother, Annie Laurie Aitken, responded to the indictment by disinheriting coma entirely from the estate that would pass to Sunny's children upon Annie Laurie's death. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her husband by decades. She had watched her daughter build a life and fill it with flowers and music and careful attention, and she had watched that life end on a bathroom floor, and she had decided, with whatever resources remained to her, to make her position on the question of who was responsible as clear as she possibly could. She died on May 4th, 1984, during the period between the two trials. She lived long enough to see Claus convicted. She did not live long enough to see him acquitted. The family Sunny had spent 20 years holding together had come apart in 7 months. The only thing they still shared was a question nobody with the authority to answer it ever would. Chapter 6. The Trial. The trial opened in Newport in January of 1982. Clarendon Court sat half a mile away, behind its iron gates, empty. Newport itself was divided in a way that small, wealthy communities divide when a scandal reaches inside them. People who had attended the same dinners and sat on the same committees now held opinions about what had happened inside Clarendon Court on the morning of December 21st, 1980, and the opinions did not reconcile. Some believed Claus, some believed Alexander, most believed something complicated and shifting that depended on which account they had read most recently. Alexander and Alla sat together on one side of the courtroom every day. They had followed every development in the investigation from the moment Alexander hired Richard Koo. They had provided the prosecution with everything Koo had found. They sat with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting a long time for something and are not certain it will go the way they need it to. Cosima did not sit with them. She was 15 years old. She sat elsewhere in the courtroom, close enough to her father to signal her position clearly, and far enough from her half-siblings that no photograph could place them together. It was the beginning of a distance she would maintain for years, at great personal cost, because she had no other option that did not require abandoning one of her parents entirely. Claus sat at the defense table with the composed expression he had worn since December 21st, 1980. He was 55 years old. He was dressed with the precision of a man who had spent his career in rooms where appearance was its own argument. He did not fidget. He did not display anxiety. He took notes on a legal pad in a handwriting that people who observed him described as small and controlled. Sunny was at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in Manhattan. She had been transferred there from Newport Hospital after it became clear that this coma was not the kind that resolved. She was in a persistent, vegetative state. She did not know the trial was happening. She did not know that the people who loved her were sitting in a courtroom 200 miles away, arguing about what had been done to her. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the needle. Dr. George Cahill, a biochemist from Harvard, was the central witness. He testified that the insulin found on the needle, recovered from Claus's black bag, was inconsistent with natural production by the human body. He told the jury that the concentration of insulin in Sunny's blood at the time of her second coma was not what you would expect from a hypoglycemic episode, even a severe one. It was what you would expect if insulin had been introduced from an external source. He testified that a deliberate injection of insulin, administered to a diabetic woman who had been drinking, could produce exactly the condition Sunny was found in on the bathroom floor. It could produce it in a way that would be difficult to distinguish from natural causes, unless someone was specifically looking for it. The defense looked for something else entirely. They argued hypoglycemia. They argued alcohol. They argued that Sunny's medical history, her depression, her use of prescription drugs, her dietary habits, explained everything the prosecution was attributing to Claus. They called witnesses who described her drinking in specific terms. They called witnesses who described her eating habits. An ice cream sundae consumed at dinner, the evening before she was found unconscious, became a piece of evidence. The defense used it to argue that a reactive hypoglycemic woman who ate that much sugar that late in the evening and then drank was producing her own crisis. They built a portrait of a woman who had been destroying her own health for years. Alexander sat in the courtroom and listened to his mother, described this way every day for weeks. He did not move. He did not react visibly. He had decided, before the trial began, that whatever was said about his mother inside that room, he would remain still, because any reaction would become the story instead of the evidence. The jury deliberated for 5 days and 22 hours. It was the longest deliberation in Rhode Island criminal history at that time. On March 16th, 1982, they returned a verdict of guilty on both counts. Judge Thomas Needham sentenced Claus von Bülow to 30 years in prison. He did not go to prison that day. His lawyers immediately filed for bail pending appeal, which was granted. He walked out of the Newport courthouse in the pale March light, a few minutes from the house on Bellevue Avenue, and he did not go to the house. He called Alan Dershowitz from his car. Chapter 7. Dershowitz and the Reversal. Alan Dershowitz was not a man who took cases he expected to lose. He was a professor at Harvard Law School, 43 years old, at the time Claus contacted him, and he had built his career on the proposition that the legal system could be made to work for people it had already decided to discard. He had represented Patty Hearst. He had represented Leona Helmsley. He had a particular appetite for cases where the verdict felt settled and the underlying legal questions did not. He was also, by his own account, expensive, and Claus von Bülow could afford him because Sunny von Bülow's money, while in dispute, was still available for legal fees while the appeal was pending. He assembled a team that included several Harvard law students. One of them was a young man named Jim Cramer, who would later become known to millions of Americans as a television financial commentator. Cramer later wrote publicly that he believed at the time of the appeal, and continued to believe decades afterward, that Claus von Bülow was supremely guilty of what he had been convicted of. He worked on the appeal, anyway, because Dershowitz had given him the assignment, and because the legal question was real, regardless of what Cramer thought about the man it was attached to. That is a detail Dershowitz does not dwell on in his book about the case. The argument Dershowitz found was not about insulin, or alcohol, or ice cream sundaes. It was about the bag. The black bag had not been found by the police. It had been found through a private investigation commissioned by Alexander von Auersperg and led by Richard Kerr. The family had hired Kerr. The family had searched the closet. The family had removed the bag and its contents. Under the law, none of that was illegal. The Fourth Amendment protects against government searches, not private ones. What the family chose to do, inside Claus von Bülow's closet, was their own business. What happened next was not. After Kerr handed the bag and its contents to the Rhode Island state authorities, the state police sent the needle to their own laboratory for chemical testing. They did not obtain a warrant before doing so. That was the moment the government became involved, and that was the moment the Fourth Amendment applied. A government agency had taken evidence and subjected it to forensic analysis without judicial authorization. Under established constitutional law, the results of that analysis could not be used at trial. The Rhode Island Supreme Court found a second error alongside the first. The trial judge had refused to give the defense access to Kerr's investigatory notes, the detailed records of what the former district attorney had found, who he had spoken to, and what he had concluded. Those notes, the court ruled, should have been available to Claus's lawyers. Denying them had impaired his ability to challenge the evidence against him. 2 rulings, 2 reversals, the needle and the notes. The thing the entire prosecution had been constructed around was gone. The Rhode Island Supreme Court overturned the conviction in 1984. The second trial opened in Providence in 1985. It was a different case from the first, because it had to be. Without the needle, the prosecution could not argue physical evidence of injection. They argued instead the circumstantial case, the motive, the mistress, the timing, the pattern of Claus's behavior around both comas. The defense argued something the first trial had not fully developed. A British physician testified that Sunny's blood sugar levels at the time of the second coma were consistent with endogenous hypoglycemia, meaning hypoglycemia produced by her own body's malfunction rather than by external insulin. He argued that her history of reactive hypoglycemia, combined with her alcohol consumption and her use of prescription drugs, could have produced her condition without any assistance from anyone. He argued, in effect, that Sunny had done this to herself. The jury deliberated. On June 10, 1985, Claus von Bülow was acquitted on both counts. He stood on the courthouse steps in Providence and held a brief press conference. He was composed. He thanked his legal team. He said he hoped the focus could now return to his wife's care. He did not elaborate. He did not take questions for long. Alexander von Auersperg read the verdict in the courtroom. He had sat through 2 trials, 1 overturned conviction, and 3 years of appeals. The legal system had given him its final answer. He did not accept it as the only answer available to him. 10 days after the acquittal, he and Alla filed a $56 million civil lawsuit against Claus on their mother's behalf. The standard of proof in a civil case is lower than in a criminal one. A jury does not have to find guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It has to find that the preponderance of evidence supports the claim. The lawsuit never reached a jury. On December 24, 1987, it was settled out of court under terms that Claus's supporters called generous and Alexander's supporters called the only admission of guilt the system had produced. Dershowitz wrote his book. The film came out in 1990. Jeremy Irons won the Academy Award for Best Actor at the ceremony in March of 1991. Sunny was at Columbia Presbyterian. She had been there for 10 years by then. She would be there for 17 more. Nobody made a film about that. Chapter 8. The Woman in the Bed. Sunny was at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center on 168th Street in Manhattan. She had been there since December of 1980. While Dershowitz constructed his Fourth Amendment argument, and Jim Cramer quietly believed his client was guilty, and Jeremy Irons prepared an Academy Award performance, she was in a room on 168th Street. She did not know about any of it. She had been moved there from Newport shortly after December 21st, 1980. She was given a private room. She was tended by nurses around the clock. Her children visited. Her mother visited until Annie Laurie Aitken died on May 4th, 1984. During the period between the 2 trials, having lived long enough to see her daughter's husband convicted, but not long enough to see him acquitted, what a coma of that duration actually means is something the coverage of the von Bülow case rarely stopped to describe. Sunny breathed. Her heart beat. Her body was maintained by the particular combination of medicine and attention that keeps a body present when the person inside it is gone. She did not speak. She did not respond to voices. She did not know that her husband had been tried twice for putting her there. She did not know he had been acquitted. She did not know about the $56 million civil lawsuit filed on her behalf. She did not know that Jeremy Irons had won an Academy Award. She did not know anything at all. Alexander visited regularly. He would sit beside the bed and speak to her in the way that people speak to someone they are not certain can hear them, but cannot bring themselves to stop speaking to. Alla visited. Cosima visited. They did not come at the same time. The civil lawsuit was settled on December 24th, 1987, 7 years after the bathroom floor. Claus agreed to divorce Sunny, give up all claims to her fortune, then estimated at between $25 and $40 million, and leave the country permanently. In exchange, Cosima was reinstated in her grandmother's will and received $30 million as her share of the estate. A man who accepted nothing from a woman's estate was either innocent and generous or guilty and careful. Claus moved to London. He wrote theatre and art reviews for publications there. He gave the occasional interview, in which he was precise and measured and revealed nothing. In a 2002 issue of Yankee magazine, he was noted to have described himself, citing a poll in the magazine Tatler, as the 46th most popular guest in London. Sunny was on 168th Street. People who visited her in those years describe a woman who looked, from the doorway, almost like herself. She was well cared for. Her hair was brushed. The room was kept as close to comfortable as a hospital room can be kept. She had been one of the most careful hostesses in Newport. She had remembered what people drank and what they didn't. She had filled Clarendon Court with flowers and music and the kind of attention that her staff stayed for decades to be part of. The room at Columbia Presbyterian had no flowers. It had no music. It had Sunny, and the sound of machines, and the silence of a woman who had spent her whole life listening and had nothing left to listen to. Chapter 9. What the Children Did. Sunny von Bülow had 3 children. Ala was born in 1958. Alexander in 1959. They were hers, from her marriage to Alfred von Auersperg. Cosima was born in 1967. Hers and Claus's. They had grown up together in Clarendon Court and on Fifth Avenue, inside the particular world their mother had built around them, which was a world defined above all by her quality of attention. She remembered what they needed. She showed up. She was the kind of mother who noticed things before she was asked to notice them, and did something about them before she was asked to do something. After December 21st, 1980, they never agreed on anything again. Alexander was 21 years old when his mother fell into the first coma in December of 1979. He was 22 when she fell into the second. He had watched the year between those 2 events with a clarity that nobody around him seems to have shared, or shared openly. He had hired Richard Koo. He had gone to the authorities. He had sat through 2 trials without moving visibly. He had filed a $56 million civil lawsuit 10 days after the acquittal. He lost every one of those fights in the legal sense of losing. The investigators' evidence was ruled inadmissible. The conviction was overturned. The acquittal stood. The civil suit settled without a verdict. Alexander did not stop. He and Ala founded 2 organizations in their mother's name. The first was the Sunny von Bülow National Victim Advocacy Center, established in Fort Worth, Texas, which later became the National Center for Victims of Crime in Washington, D.C., one of the largest victim advocacy organizations in the country. The second was the Sunny von Bülow Coma and Head Trauma Research Foundation in New York, which funded research into the medical conditions that had defined his mother's last 28 years. He had taken the thing that had been done to her and built institutions out of it. It was the only form of justice available to him once the courts had finished. Ala moved more quietly through those years. The loss had taken something from her that courtrooms and advocacy organizations and civil lawsuits could not return regardless of their outcomes. She visited her mother at Columbia Presbyterian. She raised her children. She gave occasional interviews in the early years after the trials, and then largely stopped. The public version of the von Bülow story did not have much space for a woman who simply grieved without converting her grief into action, and Ala seems to have concluded early that the public version was not something she needed to be part of. Cosima's position was the most painful and the least understood of the 3. She had been 15 years old when her father was convicted. She had been 17 when he was acquitted. She had spent those 2 years in a courtroom watching 2 sets of people who each loved her mother argue about which of them loved her correctly. She had held to her father because he was her father, and because the alternative was not holding to him, which meant deciding at 17 that the man who had raised her had tried to kill the woman who had raised her. And that was not a decision she was prepared to make on the basis of a verdict that had then been overturned. She attended the Brooks School in Massachusetts. She went to Brown University. She married Count Riccardo Pavancelli in 1996. She became a journalist and wrote about culture and the arts with a seriousness and intelligence that people who reviewed her work noted, without connecting it to the name on her byline, which was not always von Bülow. She visited her mother at Columbia Presbyterian. She did not talk about what those visits were like. She did not talk about much of what the previous decades had been like. She had grown up inside a story that belonged to everyone who had followed it in the newspapers, and to almost nobody who had actually lived it. And she had made a decision, somewhere in her 20s, to live what remained of it in private. Claus called her from London regularly. He wrote theatre reviews. He attended dinners. He was, by every account from people who observed him in those years, a devoted and attentive father to the one child who had never stopped believing in him. Whether that devotion was evidence of his innocence, or simply evidence that loving Cosima was the one thing in his life that cost him nothing, is a question nobody can answer from the outside. The 3 children of Sunny Crawford visited their mother separately for 28 years. The room at Columbia Presbyterian saw each of them, one at a time, sitting beside the bed of a woman who had spent her life paying attention to everyone around her and could no longer pay attention to anything. Alexander sat beside her and talked about her grandchildren, who had been born into a world that knew their grandmother only as a name attached to a trial. Ala sat beside her and did not talk about the trials. Cosima sat beside her and did not talk about her father. None of them knew what she could hear. None of them knew what, if anything, registered in whatever remained of the consciousness of the woman in the bed. They came anyway. They sat anyway. They talked or they didn't. And then they left. And the room went back to being what it was, which was a hospital room on 168th Street in Manhattan, where a woman who had been born on a private railway carriage in Virginia lay in a silence that nobody had been able to break for 28 years. The organizations Alexander built in her name still exist. The National Center for Victims of Crime has served tens of millions of people since its founding. It is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and works with thousands of local programs across the country. Sunny never knew about any of it. Chapter 10. The Silence. The usual explanation for what happened to Sunny von Bülow is Claus. It is the explanation the prosecution offered in 1982, and the one Alexander spent decades trying to make permanent. It is the explanation the film endorsed, and the one that most people who know the name von Bülow carry with them. A woman with $75 million, a husband with none of his own, a needle in a black bag. A motive so legible it barely needs explaining. There is truth in that explanation, and it does not explain everything. What it leaves out is the 36 years before Claus, the father who died on April 6, 1935, and left behind a fortune that was supposed to replace him. The mother who built a world of country houses and European travel and careful social positioning and called it protection. The first marriage to a prince that lasted 8 years and produced 2 children and ended in divorce. That prince, who later lay in a coma of his own for 9 years and died without waking. The pattern that nobody around Sunny recognized until it was too late to matter because nobody was looking for a pattern. They were looking at the money. What it leaves out is Sunny herself, the woman before the bathroom floor, the woman who was born on a private railway carriage in Virginia and nicknamed Choo Choo, and then nicknamed Sunny for the disposition that warranted it, who practiced music with a seriousness that surprised her teachers in London, who remembered what everyone around her needed before they asked for it, who was said to resemble Grace Kelly, and who filled Clarendon Court with flowers, and kept a staff loyal for decades, and moved through Newport society with a quietness that everyone around her consistently mistook for contentment. Nobody asked whether it was contentment. Nobody thought to ask. Maria Schrailhammer, the maid who found Sunny on the bathroom floor on the morning of December 22nd, 1980, testified at both trials. She testified about what she had seen and what she had heard, and what she believed about the man she had watched move through that house for 14 years. She was one of the few people in the entire legal proceeding who had actually been present inside the marriage, who had seen it from the corridors and the kitchens and the service rooms that guests never see. Her testimony was among the most damaging the prosecution produced at the first trial. It was among the things the second trial could not undo, because verdicts can be overturned, but testimony cannot be unheard by the people who sat in the courtroom and listened to it. She had worked for Sunny for years before December 1980. She worked for the family that survived Sunny for years afterward. She never changed her account of what she believed had happened. Sunny von Bülow died on December 6, 2008, at Mary Manning Walsh Nursing Home in Manhattan. She was 76 years old. She had been unconscious for 28 years, which is longer than many people's marriages, longer than most people's careers, longer than the time between the day George Crawford died and the day his daughter married for the first time. Her memorial service was held on January 14th, 2009, at the Brick Presbyterian Church in New York. It was the same church where she and Claus had been married on June 6, 1966. All 3 of her children were there. They sat in the same room, It was one of the few times in 28 years that they had managed it. She is buried in St. Mary's Episcopal Churchyard in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. The name on her gravestone is Martha Sharp Crawford, not von Bülow, not Sunny. The name she was born with, before the railway carriage, and the nicknames, and the princes, and the fortune, and the man who may or may not have put her on a bathroom floor in Newport on the morning of December 22nd, 1980. Her children chose that name. They had 3 options. They chose the one that predated all of it. Claus died in London on May 25th, 2019. He was 92. He had spent the last 30 years of his life in a flat in Belgravia, writing theatre reviews and attending dinners, and describing himself, in a 2002 Tatler poll, as the 46th most popular guest in London. He never discussed what had happened at Clarendon Court. He took whatever he knew about the morning of December 22nd, 1980, to a flat in Belgravia and left it there. Clarendon Court sold in 2012 for $13 million. It sold again in 2021 for $30 million, a Rhode Island record. The iron gates are still there on Bellevue Avenue. The stone walls are still there. The cobblestone courtyard, the carriage house, the pale stone facade that Horace Trumbauer reproduced from a drawing by a Scottish architect who never intended it to end up on the Rhode Island coast above the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic is still visible from the grounds, moving the way it always moves along that stretch of coast, which is to say, without any interest in what happens in the houses above it. What I keep coming back to is the gravestone. She spent more than 40 years known to the world as Sunny von Bülow. She spent 28 of those years unable to speak, unable to correct the record, unable to tell anyone what she knew, or what she wanted, or who she was, underneath the name the trial had made famous. And at the end, the name her children put on the stone was not the name the world knew her by. It was not the name of either husband. It was not a title or a social position or an association with a legal case that had consumed 3 decades of public attention. It was Martha Sharp Crawford, the little girl born on a railway carriage somewhere in Virginia on September 1st, 1931, before the fortune and the nicknames and the princes and the maid who found her on a bathroom floor and the husband who may or may not have put her there. That is who they buried. That is who she was. That is who she had always been, underneath everything the money built around her, and the trial built on top of that, and the silence that came after. Martha Sharp Crawford. Before all of it,